lot of people. Okay, before I start, I'm going to say I'm very nervous, so if anything starts shaking, just ignore it for the moment. Okay, so like they said, I work at Netflix. A couple months ago, or actually probably more like 6 months ago, I started a new project. Like a lot of you probably like to do, and like I usually do when I start something new, I went into our code base to see what existed, what I might need to build from scratch to do my job. And I started to realize that a lot of the components we have actually look very similar, and they behave very similarly, but they're all in different files. And I like to organize things too, so I was wondering, why couldn't these all be in the same component? These could all be the same set of code. Why do we have so much duplicate code everywhere? And this is somewhat universal. This is something I run into on a day-to-day basis at Netflix. This is something I ran into at my previous company, AdRoll, which is also in the Bay Area. And I became so hyper-organized that we even went so far as to build a whole UI component library at AdRoll. Now, why would you go that far? Why would you even build a UI component library? At the time, AdRoll was growing. It still is growing, but we were aggressively pushing new products, which often led to new teams. And we were also trying to break all of our products outside of one monolithic code base into new repositories. Basically, this means that our teams over time became more loosely coupled, and they also had the freedom and the responsibility to choose whatever frameworks and tools they wanted to in their new code bases. One of the second reasons was that at the same time, our product and UX teams were pushing to unify the look and feel of all of our products so that it felt like one cohesive experience for the user, even though different teams were building them in different code bases with different frameworks. So those are my qualifications for being up here talking about reusable UI components. Hi, I'm Mars. I'm a senior software engineer at Netflix. I like reusable UI components a lot. I'm not an expert, but I have a lot of opinions, and I want to share those with you today. I want to share some of the best practices that I learned while trying to write this library, some of the ways we decided to write our components, and the best ways to distribute them to other teams. Before going forward, though, I want to clarify what I mean by a reusable UI component, because we will be talking about this in the context of React, which also has its own concept of components. So when I say a reusable UI component, I mean a component of your UI, literally. So for example, a navbar, a graph, a data table, something that your users can interact with. And these themselves can be built of multiple React components that can be composed together to make a larger reusable UI component. If I say throughout the talk the word component, I generally am talking about the reusable UI component kind as opposed to a React component. So just to avoid any confusion, because this word is going to come up a lot. So why are we talking about reusable UI components, though, built specifically in React? Why did we choose to use React at AdRoll, and why do we at Netflix continue to choose React every time we try to solve a similar problem? The first reason is that React uses JSX. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, but I just want to kind of go over these points quickly to set some context. So React uses JSX, which looks a lot like a templating language, but it's backed by the full power of JavaScript. So essentially, you can have your markup and your UI logic living in the same file, and oftentimes even the same function. Now this is really useful because this means you have fewer files per reusable UI component that you're trying to share. And I don't know about you, but the minute I try to use a new tool or framework, the fewer files that I have to deal with, the better. The second reason we chose React was that React components are declarative. So the markup that ends up in the DOM is declarative depending on the input. So in React, we have two types of input in a sense. We have the internal React component state, and we have props that are passed in from parent components to child components. Why is this important, though, for building reusable UI components, especially ones that you intend to share across teams and projects? This basically means that we can have components now that control the look and feel and the interaction, but they can do it independently of the parent components that are importing them. But at the same time, they don't need to care about the data that they're trying to render. And this is useful if you're trying to make your UIs look consistent, because they will behave consistently, but they don't need to care about where the data comes from or what it looks like necessarily. And the third point, this is not something that React explicitly advertises, but it can be easily ported into different frameworks. So what I mean by that is a React component can be easily used inside of, let's say, a Backbone view or an Angular view. And this is just much more easily than it is to use a React component inside of, a Backbone view or an Angular view inside of a React component. And this has to do with the virtual DOM diffing that React does in order to figure out how to update your UI. So basically, this means we no longer need to care what frameworks or tools or build systems that other teams are using in order to use the reusable UI components that we're building. So let's talk about how these reusable UI components should be built. So I learned two things building UI components over and over again. And the first one is that they should be self-sufficient. What I mean by that is that your components should do one thing in your UI and they should do it well, but they should also be able to maintain the look and feel of, the component independently of the parent project or application or wherever it's being used. The second thing that I learned is that they need to be really easy to integrate with. It should be easy for others to understand how to use, to just import your component, to import them into their projects. It should be easy for others to understand what they're expected to do, how they're expected to look and behave. So basically, the burden is on you as a reusable UI component developer to make it easy for others to understand. And this is important because the easier they are to use and understand, the more likely they are to be adopted and reused and shared. Now, these two lessons aren't specific to React. I would argue that they're actually a good way of thinking about building reusable UI components in general. So if you're out there in the audience and you're wondering, okay, I don't use React on a day-to-day basis, but I want to build things other people can use, these 2 points are really great to take home with you and to think about. So for this talk, I'm going to use a quick example. Just a quick disclaimer, this example here that we're using and the code that I'm going to show is not something that we use in production at Netflix, but I wanted to use something that people might recognize, which leads into my next question. Does anyone recognize this? Okay, good. Some people are logging into their Netflix accounts. This is what we call our back-of-the-box component, and it's lovingly named Bob. So this is Bob. So when you log into a Netflix account, you're a member, you log in, you'll generally see a list of things you can watch. They're, tiny little images. And when you click on one of those images, it's going to expand into this, which is the back of the box, which is named actually for the back of the DVD box. In the old days, you'd go pick up a physical DVD, you'd read the back, and it would have some information. This is the digital version. So we use the Bob for lots of different types of content. So TV shows, movies, originals, we have some interactive content now. And the idea behind this being a reusable UI component, at least in the Netflix context, is we want it to behave and look and feel the same no matter what type of content the user is looking at. So we want them to be able to recognize this UI if they're looking at interactive content, if they're looking at a TV show or a movie. So this component here will have this general overview tab always. It has some sort of an image, it has a title, some overview text, and some tabs at the bottom. But what these tabs are here can actually change depending on the type of content that you're looking at. So for a movie, we might have overview, details, and trailers. But if we also have a TV show, we'll also have a separate tab for, let's say, episodes or seasons that you can click into and you can start watching your content. So, like I said, we want this to be reusable and recognizable no matter what type of content you're looking at, but also want it to be flexible enough to support A/B testing, which is something that we do a lot of at Netflix. So essentially, this is a reusable UI component in our context. It's meant to support a lot of different use cases. It's kind of a simple example for a reusable UI component, but for the purposes of this talk, we don't need anything too complicated, just something that we can use to illustrate our points. So, to the first point, reusable UI components should be self-sufficient. They should do one thing in your UI, they should do it well, and they should do it independently of the parent application. Essentially, anyone using your component doesn't need to do too much configuration for your component to look and feel and behave as you've advertised that it's supposed to look and feel and behave. So in terms of React specifically, this means that our UI components shouldn't worry about the data. And React actually gives us a way, an affordance to do this, which would be the props. So our component doesn't do any of the data fetching. It doesn't really care where it comes from. It doesn't really care what it looks like. Especially if you're in a multi-application Netflixy world, our data might come from different endpoints, and all of those responses might look a little bit different every time. So our reusable UI component doesn't need to know where the data comes from, but rather the parent component will know what shape the data is in, and it will kind of bridge the gap between the API and our reusable UI component. At the same time, our component should, in a sense, have enough state to be useful. So we accept our data as props, but the interaction information that we care about is kept as part of the internal React state. So here, in our example, our component just cares about which tab is currently selected. So then based on that state that we keep internally and the data that's being passed to us from the parent, we'll render what we need to be rendered based on how the user is interacting with it. So by having these two things in combination, the props and the internal state, this is how our components, or our reusable UI components, can be self-sufficient. And this just works out of the box. Basically, the parent project will import it, the user can start to click around and everything, and the parent doesn't need to do anything or have any click handlers in order for that to work. Granted, you pass some data in the first place. At the same time, and kind of going on with this idea about internal state, we should be able to communicate back to the parent project that something internal to the component, the UI state, has changed. So in React, child components, their state cannot be accessed by parent components, but it's still important to allow the parent to know that something has changed. They don't control what's going on in your component or the state, but this is important in case you want to do something with that information in the parent application. For example, log that someone's clicked on the tab, and perhaps do some analysis later on it to understand how your users are using your application. So the component will have enough state to be useful, it will communicate back to the parent, but it can also allow the parent project or component to initialize it in any state. This is important, for example, if you want to have some sort of sticky preferences in your application, you want to allow the component to be rendered initially in a certain state. But we were talking about consistency also. So we can allow the parent project to initialize our component in any state, but we don't want it to allow the parent to control the state at all times. So in our component we'll receive props function here, we're going to ignore any updates to the currently selected tab. So this basically means that if a user does the same action over and over again, either in your application or in another application written by a different team, it's going to behave the same way. We won't have any deviations from the expected behavior. So on to our second point, which is about ease of integration. So in addition to being self-sufficient, components should be easy to use. I'm probably sounding like a broken record now, but just bear with me. And this helps with reusability, like I said, because it makes it easier for other teams to adopt the components that you've written. At a high non-React specific level, we basically want to make the component interface easy to understand. You want to make it easy for other developers to know the touch points between their application or their project and your reusable UI component. In terms of React, what we really mean is we talk about the component props. So back to Bob. Looking at Bob, we probably would expect for this particular UI a title, some overview text. Like I said earlier, we have the tabs at the bottom, and we have some sort of cover art or image. And so this is what the props would look like for this example. So one of the first ways to make your component easy to understand and integrate with is to have it be self-documenting. And so React gives us this way to do that, which would be the prop type definitions. The slides is a bit dense, and I don't expect you to read it all, obviously, but just to give you an idea of how descriptive prop types could look for even such a small component. So we can specify which props our component requires. We can even get more granular than that and specify what types we expect these props to be. So for our tabs, we expect not only to have them, but that they're an array of objects, and that every object has a key, display name, and content attribute. So if you haven't seen prop types defined like this before, I would highly recommend looking at the React documentation because it can be very powerful. And you can also write custom validators if you need to do some more complicated prop validation. So by defining props like this, someone can quickly tell what they need to pass in. And you can also take advantage of React's warning system, or perhaps in React 16, I think now it's more of an error. Developers can tell at runtime what props are missing, or if they've passed in a prop of the wrong type. If you want to go one step further, you can actually use a plugin called Gulp React Docs. This is a Gulp plugin which will take in a list of React files, and it will parse the prop type definitions, the comments above some of those props. Actually, it'll even go into your getDefaultProps function to understand what props are defaulting to what values, and it's going to spit out markdown that looks a lot like this. So now other developers don't even need to dig through your source code in order to figure out what props your component expects. And this is really nice from project to project because everyone always organizes their files a little differently. To make your components easy to integrate with, you can also have fewer props. This does two things. This one will reduce the cognitive load on other developers when they try to understand your component, and it's also going to reduce the number of touch points between their application and your component, which sometimes can translate into fewer points of failure later. So there's a couple ways to do this, and one of the first ways is actually to define flexible props, which basically, when I say that, I mean to support as many use cases as you can with as few props as possible. So in order to do this, you may need to internalize some of the complexity to support the flexibility. But again, if you're going for ease of use and adoption, it ends up being worth it. So looking at our component again, let's focus on the title now. Here we have a title that has a little bit of text and a logo. You can imagine we might want some more special treatment here as well. Let's say you have a TV show that has a new season that just came out. You can add like a badge to it that says new episodes in like a Netflix red color or something like that. So in our component, this is how we've defined our title prop. It can be either a string or an element. Now, another way to do this would also have been to define two different props, one called title logo source, which would be a string, which would be essentially a file, like it points to an image that you can load on an image tag. And the second would have been to also define a title string prop, which would have just been some text. But this actually supports less use cases. Now we've not only limited what our logo can be, which is it can either be an image or it can be a string, but we've also confused other developers because it's unclear here what will happen when you pass in both props at once. Another way to have fewer props is to decouple them. So back to our example. Here at the bottom, let's say we actually don't want any tabs to show up at all. We just want this to be some sort of like display card. We just want the title, the cover image, and the overview text. One way to do this, obviously, would be to add a hide tabs prop, which would toggle whether or not the tabs show up. But I argue instead that the component should take the responsibility to intelligently render the tabs. So what I mean by that is if we have no tabs prop, or if our tabs array is 0, we just don't render anything at all. So this eliminates the need for an extra prop, which, like I mentioned before, will reduce the cognitive load on other developers. It also makes the component more resilient to developer error, because they may have, if you have both the hide tabs and the tabs prop, perhaps they've passed them in a combination that doesn't quite make sense. And it'll also decrease the likelihood of unexpected behavior. So continuing on this topic of making your components easy to use, one of the things we did as well was to make sure that we had no backdoors into our reusable UI components. So this is really more of an internal implementation detail than it is a prop type or interface issue. But if we look at our component here, We talked earlier about wanting to let the parent component know that something in our internal UI state has changed. And so the way we do that in our component is we have a click handler in our render tab function that calls our own handle tab handler up at the top. And so we'll set the state. We want to keep track of the currently selected tab, but we'll also call an on-click handler that was passed into us on a tab events prop from the parent. Another way to implement this in ES6, for example, would have just been to use the spread operator and pass the tab events prop, attach it to the React div. But this is bad for a few reasons. One, the spread operator is not very performant. Two, the parent project or the other developer now has a backdoor into your component. This will work for the use case of attaching the on-click handler to let them know that something in our state has changed, but now they could pass in anything they want. They could pass in a class name, they could pass in handlers for other events like hovers and blurs and that kind of thing. And so this could lead to unexpected behavior in a particular project, but also eventually inconsistent behavior across multiple projects. So we've talked a lot about JavaScript and React, but reusable UI components aren't just about JavaScript. A lot of the times it's also about how you can style them and how you can place them. So for a reusable UI component to be, as we call it, reusable, you essentially want it to take up 100% of the width and height of the container that it's in. So when you're developing, you just want no unexpected margin or padding. There's kind of a caveat here if you have a border. You can have some padding, but essentially, if you think about it, you want the visible edge of your component to not have any additional padding around it or margin. So this makes it really easy and reusable because now, if a parent project will have a wrapper DOM element around it, the parent can control the width and height and positioning and layout of that parent element, and your component will kind of just grow to fill that element, which makes it very easy to place it and lay it out. So the parent application doesn't need to, dig into your code, figure out what class names to override or what styles to override, and it will look consistent across projects and also be way easier for someone else to use. So, quick summary. I'm going to say it again, it's probably the 5th time, but reusable UI components, at least the way I think about them, no matter what framework they're built in, if it's React, if it's Backbone, if it's Angular, they should be self-sufficient. They should look and behave consistently. They shouldn't have to rely on the parent application to do that. And they should be easy to integrate with. And I don't expect anyone to take this as a mandate. These are just, one woman's opinions. And this is just how I like to think about building reusable UI components day to day. So thank you, everyone, for listening. Please feel free to follow me on Twitter.